Welcome back to Dark Stories for you. Something has been killing the animals of Weeping River Forest. Today we found out what. The computer whirred as Officer Chase loaded up the drive and played back the footage taken from the deceased victim. A decent quality image developed on the screen, one showing the green, vibrant surroundings of Weeping River Forest, brilliant nature, but basked in an eerie, unnatural silence. The footage had come from the body cam of a hunter and his partner, who'd both been sent into the forest to retrieve samples from animals inflicted with a thus far unknown disease. Of the two, only one of them ever returned. "I'm telling you, Frank, I hit it," the person in view, Eric, claimed. In his left hand he held a hunting rifle, his right hand well removed from the trigger. "Then where is it?" Frank asked, already appearing impatient. "I don't know, but it can't have gotten far. That was a center shot. Didn't look like it from where I was standing." They pushed their way through the dense vegetation, searching for their prey. The picture bounced and lost focus as Frank brushed against the leaves and branches, momentarily obscuring the picture. When it returned, Eric was crouching behind a tree where his target had fallen over, weakened by the blood loss. "Told you I got it," Eric proudly announced. "Fine, I believe you. You owe $10. Whatever, let's get this done." Frank moved to get the animal closer into view, inspecting what appeared to be a little fawn. It had sustained a bullet wound to the edge of its abdomen, not high enough to his any vital organs, nor sever important arteries, which meant it would suffer a slow and miserable death. Oddly enough, it didn't appear to bleed at all, and the short distance it had been able to cover didn't make sense considering how bad the shot had been. "Where do you think the mother went?" Eric asked. "I don't know. Didn't see her anywhere. Fawns don't move around though, unless the mother's already dead, right?" "Yeah, they usually just hide and wait." They then noticed a more serious wound on its rump, an obviously old injury seemingly infected by a red, fungal-like pathogen based solely on its optical appearance. Both of the hunters seemed perplexed by the sight, inspecting it more thoroughly. Where the gash itself had come from also remained a mystery. It hadn't been shot, nor was the wound clean enough to have been caused by a knife. Though there were bears in the area, it didn't resemble a bear attack. "Is this what we're looking for?" Eric asked. "I have no idea. Check if the gunshot wound is lethal, or put this damn thing out of its misery." "All right, fine, hold on," Eric said, as he prepared his rifle for a euthanizing shot. "Wait, you seeing this?" Eric bent down and inspected the newly created gunshot injury, which should have been bleeding more in spite of its unfortunate location. But something appeared to be preventing the poor creature from bleeding out. Inside the wound, small red fibers could be seen, stretching in from the direction of its rump. It looked akin to the fungal infection already infesting its old injury, but it couldn't have moved that fast unless it was already digging its way towards the fawn's organs. "What is this shit?" Eric said as he reached his hand out to touch it. "Don't even think about—" Frank began, but it was too late. Eric had reached the red fibers, which immediately wrapped themselves around his finger, digging through his skin in less than a second. Eric yelped in pain and pulled his hand back, immediately severing the fungus. "Fuck, what the hell was that?" "Just do your damn job and kill the thing while I collect a sample. And for God's sake, stop touching everything you see. Use your eyes." Yeah, sorry," Eric said, as he finally loaded his rifle and shot the fawn in its head, killing it instantly. "Good. Now we can work in peace." "Did the thing hurt you?" Frank asked, not sounding convincingly concerned. "It's nothing. What exactly are we dealing with, though? Some kind of zombie deer disease?" "You mean chronic wasting disease? No, this ain't it. In fact, this looks nothing like that. Remind me again why I brought you on this job." Frank, using a bit more consideration before touching the infected animal, put on gloves, pulled out a test tube, and cut off a piece of the infected flesh. "This is for our friends at the university. They'll know what in God's name this stuff is." with little more of note occurring as Frank secured his sample, and as Eric tended to his minor wound. The footage was forwarded to the hunter's trek back to the town of Croydon. Officer Chase sighed, warning me of the uncomfortable sight that would soon come. Though I still felt uneased by the situation, even afraid, I had learned to suppress emotions like these. You know, there's no need to watch this. I can just describe what I saw. Whatever happened, I can assure you I've seen worse, I shot back. All right, if you say so. We now watched the hunters as they followed the main path out of the forest. Eric had fallen slightly behind, complaining about fatigue and asking for a short break. Frank turned to face him, letting out an annoyed grunt, which quickly turned to concern as he saw the state of his partner. Even from a distance, Eric looked noticeably worse for wear. His face had turned pale, droplets of sweat covered his face, and he slouched over as if struggling to stand on his feet. "You all right?" Frank asked, finally able to feign a modicum of worry. "Something," was all Eric managed to get out before violently vomiting the contents of his stomach onto the ground. His speech started to slur, and his gait became unsteady. Frank moved closer to support his struggling partner, and only then did we notice red strands of the same pathogen afflicting the deer, now covering Eric's arm and neck. "Jesus, why the hell did you have to go ahead and touch that fucking thing?" Frank asked as he went to assist Eric stand upright, but the strands of red fibers immediately started rubbing off onto Frank, and before either could react, Eric fell unconscious to the ground. Though both were large men, there was no way Frank could carry his weight without help. "Eric!" Frank called out, gently slapping his friend's face in a futile attempt at waking him. "I'm going to go and get help, all right? Just stay here. Don't move." The footage ended shortly after, either from the camera being shut off or due to malfunction. Whatever the case, I had gotten all the information I needed to proceed with my case. "Where are the men in the footage?" I asked, already assuming they had both perished following the infection, but I needed to know what had happened to their bodies. Eric Crawford was never found. We're assuming that he tried to continue his escape, but in his state, he probably got lost. We've organized a search party, but you can cancel the search party. Eric Crawford is dead, I interrupted. Even if that were the case, we still need to retrieve the body, Officer Chase argued. Actually, you don't. This case is no longer under your jurisdiction. Whatever killed these two men needs to be handled with appropriate caution. Your supervisor has already received orders to comply with every request I make, and I expect you to do so. What the hell are you talking about? Call your captain. He'll confirm. Officer Chase did as instructed, and though I wished the man no ill will, he was on a need-to-know basis. The more involved in the assignment he got, the more at risk his life would be. Pushing him aside was a kindness, all things considered, and a quick call was enough to confirm what I had already told him. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he asked after hanging up. "Someone who's here to help," I said. "Now tell me what happened to Frank's body." Mr. Dale died a day later, suffering similar symptoms as his hunting partner. "And his body?" "You haven't heard?" the officer asked. "They cremated the body on orders from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. We hadn't even concluded our side of the investigation before I found the paperwork already signed on my desk." "Damn it," I mumbled. "They overstepped their boundaries. Do you still have the samples?" "Already shipped to the CDC," Chase said. "But don't worry, there are plenty more bodies where they came from." He was referring to the rapidly decreasing animal population within the forest and the many bodies that had been found with similar injuries. Luckily, the hikers and hunters had mostly thought it better to leave them alone, alerting the authorities without touching the clearly infected animals, an act which had absolutely prevented a major outbreak. All that remained was to contain the threat and ascertain its origin. We already escorted a team of biologists and whatnot to investigate inside the forest. You don't happen to know them? I'm afraid I don't. Would you take me to them? Since I'm under obligation to follow your every whim, sure, the officer responded sarcastically. Because the company had sent me in with only limited information about the newly discovered organism, I was in the dark as to exactly what I was dealing with. But the first part of my job was to designate a threat category to the pathogen and recommend further actions to contain it. So, with the assistance of a few officers, I would be taken to the site of the infection, deep inside the heart of Weeping River Forest. Officer Chase let me ride in his patrol car, taking me directly to the scientists in the forest. Progress was slow along the dirt road, which had seen better times. Based on the blooming plants and greenery, one would never suspect that something within had gone awry. Chase, naturally, was curious and kept pushing for answers, wanting to know more about the purpose of my visit and what kind of threat we were dealing with. I have a family, you know. I need to know if I have to get my kids out of town, he argued. Don't you worry about that, officer. If we get to that, I'll make sure people make it to safety. Come on, man. I'm doing you a favor. How about you return it? Letting the request sink in, I hesitated to answer, mostly to innocently tease the untruthful driver. I understood his need to know, but he'd be happier if he was left in the dark. Well, I'd help you, but since you don't have a family... I let my words trail off. Fine, I lied. You can't blame me for trying, though, he asked, almost embarrassed. After a 20-minute drive into the forest, we were about to reach the end of the road and were met with a roadblock kept under control by 2 more officers. Next to them stood a parked patrol vehicle and van undoubtedly used to transport science equipment for the field team that was nowhere to be seen. "Chase, what are you doing here?" one of the officers asked. "I've been given the great honor of bringing Dr. Livingston to join up with the CDC team on site," Chase said, again with a delightful hint of sarcasm. The officer sighed. "Fine, but you stay here until I've called them." Using a radio, he called one of the scientists on site and explained the situation. The deal remained the same. We were to wait at our location until the leader of the operation could pick us up. Half an hour later, a woman dressed in a hazmat suit arrived at our checkpoint. Only once she had crossed the line did she remove the helmet to introduce herself as Lisa Pearson, the doctor in charge of what she called a research expedition. While I had heard her name in some of my scientific circles, I hadn't been notified that she'd be in charge of the mission. "Dr. Livingston, I presume. I've been awaiting you," she said with a sly smirk. "Awaiting me?" I asked. "Is that so?" "I got a rather stern call from one of your supervisors and was advised that my career depended on our cooperation." "More than just our careers, I'm afraid," I explained. "That's how I understood it too," she agreed, surprisingly unaffected by what could only have been perceived as threats. "Shall we?" Before venturing beyond the checkpoint, I was ordered to don a hazmat suit like her. Since the nature of the pathogen remained uncertain, we couldn't tell whether or not it was airborne or purely transmitted by touch. Taking off my coat, my holstered gun was left clearly visible, but while the officer seemed uneased by the fact, Pearson seemed almost unfazed. Putting on the hazmat suit, I reattached my holster on the outside, refusing to leave my arm behind. In addition, the belt held a flashlight, a knife, and a lighter. Leaving the officers behind, I joined Dr. Pearson as we headed deeper into the forest, straying off the dirt road. Though I had noticed it before, the overwhelming silence only became apparent once we'd gotten far enough away from town to not be able to hear the sounds of traffic and people. I'd expected at least bird song and insects, but there was nothing except for the wind blowing through the trees to be heard. "I've read some of your work, Dr. Pearson. I particularly enjoyed your paper on the possibility of an undetected upcoming prion epidemic. I'm impressed you've read it, mostly considering it wasn't ever published among fears it might cause mass hysteria." "I have my contacts," I replied. "Oh, I know. I've heard a lot about your work. I have high expectations from you on this assignment." Genuinely surprised by that last statement, She had piqued my curiosity. In my field of work, having a reputation is ill-advised. How come you've heard about me?
I have my contacts, she cheekily replied. Thin red strands began to appear among the moss and grass on the ground, all leading towards a point deeper within the forest. In the distance, we could hear chatter, slightly muffled underneath the hazmat suits I assumed them to be wearing. At the research site, we met with 2 fellows working under Dr. Pearson, with 2 more not on site, tasked with following the many red fibers littering the ground. The 2 that were present were hanging over a quickly set up field lab, where they'd examined a dissected animal. Its organs lay on display, wrapped in what I assumed was a fungus, which had turned gray and brittle once the animal had perished. And because the connection to the red strands and cords that led even further into the forest had been severed, 2 other animals lay ready for examination. Another one severed from the strands, and a third still connected, still breathing but unconscious. The latter still had the fresh red fibers attached, a fact I made note of. "Mark and Gerard aren't back yet?" Pearson asked. "Not yet. Should I radio them?" Jane replied. "Give them time. I have a new colleague to introduce you to. This is Dr. Livingston." Pearson introduced me to her 2 crew members, Jane Davies and Gerard Hudson. Those absent were Mark Lawrence and Bill Connor. The 2 briefly shook my hand, seeming almost offended that their work would be interrupted by another party. I suspected they didn't wish to share the credit. Neither acknowledged the weapon I carried, but their attitudes towards me remained rather cold. "What can you tell me about the organism?" I asked. "Well, I can tell you what it's not," Jane began. "Go on." "When we first encountered an infected specimen, we suspected the pathogen to be some kind of fungus. I take it it's something else. It's not viral, bacterial, fungal, nor a prion. It's parasitic in nature, considering it feeds off living creatures, but it holds no resemblance to any known species. These red fibers we see scattered around the jungle are covered in non-striated muscle cells with primitive intestinal tubes and a vascular system. There's even evidence of a near-invisible but sophisticated nervous system." "Conclusion?" I asked. "We don't have one yet, but the organism doesn't seem to belong to any one part of the phylogenetic tree. It seems almost engineered." Jane paused, letting me digest the information she'd just handed me. Despite the obvious dangers posed by the organism, she didn't seem worried. In fact, she seemed almost gleeful as she explained the specifics, excited to be studying a brand new form of life. I had to respect her enthusiasm. "Why was only one of the specimens left alive?" I asked. "Because we..." Before Jane could answer the question, a 4th member of the team came stumbling through the forest, out of breath and frazzled. But his partner was nowhere in sight. "Where's Mark?" Jane asked, worry clearly present in her voice. "He's stuck, trapped inside a cave. I couldn't help him." Bill managed to get out between gasps for air. "Tell me exactly what's going on," Pearson demanded. Bill collapsed to the ground in exhaustion, clearly having sprinted quite a distance to get help. Once he'd taken a few seconds to compose himself, he started explaining what had happened. "We followed the fibers into the forest. Along the way, they were converging into thicker cords, all leading to the same place, going inside a bear dwelling, which was connected to a cave." "Did you go inside?" I asked. "No, it would have been too risky. We were going to come back and inform Dr. Pearson, but then we heard someone call for help from inside the cave. It sounded like they were stuck," Bill explained. "I tried to convince Mark that we needed to get help, but he refused to listen. He went inside alone." "And you let him?" Jane yelled, agitated. "What was I supposed to do? Drag him back with me?" Bill asked. "You should have done something," Jane went on. "You can berate him later," Pearson said. "Can you show us where it is?" "I suppose we could just follow the red strands," I chimed in, to which Bill just nodded enthusiastically, not ready to voluntarily return. "Then let's go," Pearson said, already gathering a few tools in preparation to leave. "No, you're staying here," I'll go alone, I argued. The hell you will! I'm coming with you, Jane demanded. She wouldn't back down, but the intrigue about the organism had been entirely replaced by worry about her colleague. Though keeping a brave facade, she was visibly trembling, but not with fear for her own safety. It's dangerous. Hence the gun? She asked. I was in the Marines for a while. I have no aversion to danger, and I don't need you to guarantee my safety. I'm coming with you, and that's that. Knowing I held no real authority over the team, I agreed to let her come. She was capable, that much was clear, and more importantly, she was determined. Pearson and the rest of her team would remain behind, alerting the officers to the possible dangers, and should the need arise, Pearson would know who to contact. With that in mind, I left her with my own cell phone, the only means of contacting my supervisor at the company. If we don't return within the next hour, you call this number and tell them we're dealing with a Category 5 encounter. What exactly does that mean? Pearson asked. Just tell them. Promise it. I will. 1 hour. Understood. What is marked to you? I asked Jane as we progressed deeper into the forest. Colleague, friend, boyfriend? Though I didn't ask out of personal interest, I did find it interesting how willing she was to jump into danger. If I was going to rely on her, I needed to know exactly what kind of person I was working with. Why? I need an ulterior motive to help him? People usually do, I went on. I just don't want anything to happen to him. Isn't that enough? It is, but I can't promise anything. We followed the thousands of converging red filaments as they turned to thick cords of twitching vine-like structures, all heading the same way. Each of their strands had originated from various dying or dead animals that had long since succumbed to the infection, but their bodies appeared to keep going, preventing their corpses from decaying. After about 10 minutes of brisk walking, we reached the entrance, a point where an uncountable number of the organism's appendages merged. There were no calls for help like Bill had described, but there was a faint rumbling emerging through the opening, akin to rasped, struggled breathing. So, what happens if we don't make it? Jane asked. You might as well tell me. Chances are we're heading for our deaths. Pearson makes a call back to my supervisor, and the company I work for deals with the situation. What company might that be? It's better if you don't know, was all I could explain. This is your job then? Risking your life for strangers? Jane asked. She sounded nervous, but attempted to hide that fact by acting annoyed at my presence, while also asking question after question to distract herself from the dangers we were about to face. Something like that. I entered the cave first, careful not to step on any of the cords littering the floor. No sooner had we crossed the threshold than the atmosphere turned heavy and the air unnaturally warm, humid. With a wet bulb temperature that high, there was a real possibility that any victims trapped within the cave might have already perished from a heat stroke or simple dehydration. Even our suits wouldn't be able to protect us from these elements, which meant we only had a limited amount of time before we would be forced to retreat. Then we found our first victim, a small fox entirely ensnared in the red filaments, fusing its body with the organism. Small tendrils emerged from the exposed organs, seeming to react to our presence, waving back and forth as we moved around the fox. But in spite of its obviously lethal injuries, the poor creature remained alive. Its eyes darted around the tunnel in panic, but it lacked the strength and mobility to tear itself free. Oh God, that poor thing, Jane said, her thoughts quickly returning to the matter at hand. Do you think the organism can sense our presence? It's not our presence that it senses, I replied, as I pulled out a lighter, lit it up, and waved it in front of the tendrils, which diligently followed the flame. They were cautious not to get too close, lest they burn, showing some sense of self-preservation. Though primitive, the organism was able to sense elements that could harm it. They react to heat, I explained. I pulled out the knife attached to my belt and severed the main cord from the suffering fox. In response, a new one grew out from the base, attempting to re-establish contact with the main organism. All the while, the fox winced in pain. It wasn't until I slit its throat and cut the cord simultaneously before the fox finally stopped breathing. The tendrils within withered away, their crimson color turning a dull gray. The organism had functioned as a biological life support system, but the extent of its purpose wasn't yet known. We followed the main appendage of the organism, leading us further into the dwelling. There, we met with the cave's previous occupants, a bear and its litter of 5 cubs, all huddled up, enveloped in the organism's flesh. The mother seemed to have suffered the most, her body emaciated and her muscles atrophied. It was the first confirmation we had that not only did the organism infect its individuals, but it appears to be feeding off them. "This is just cruel," Jane said. "Why won't it just let them die?" "You keep your meat in the fridge to keep it fresh?" I asked in return. "Yeah, but... And yet, you and me, we don't decompose outside of the fridge, right?" "What does that?" "Oh," Jane said, quickly understanding why the animals had to be kept alive. "Meat is best kept fresh while it's still breathing. I'm not sure this thing is capable of understanding the concept of suffering. It's just following its nature. We shouldn't take it personal." Leaving the sleuth of bears alone, we proceeded deeper into the dwelling, where it joined with a large network of caves. The further we walked, the denser the growths on the floors and walls got to the point where we could barely take a step without treading on the organism. With the heat almost reaching body temperature, and with our suits shielding us, the organism seemed mostly unaware of our presence, unable to detect our thermal signatures. Just a few filaments attempted to reach out, but couldn't penetrate our suits. Still, their attempts to ensnare us were enough to throw us off balance. Wrapping their appendages around Jane's ankle, she was the first to slip. I was barely able to grab her before she stumbled into the cave walls, which might very well have slit through her suit, exposing her to the organism. We continued through a couple of intersections, through twists and turns, trying to take note of various landmarks to find our way back out. With all the connecting tunnels, there had to be several openings to the cave network, because from each accessory passage, more cords joined in through the narrower paths. Loud echoes reverberated throughout the caves for each clumsy step we took, but the organism showed no outwards reaction to sound. "Hello?" a voice called out from the dark. "Is there anyone there?" Around the corner, we found Jane's colleague, Mark. He was leaning against the cave wall, and his suit had been torn on his right shoulder, where the filaments had attached, eating their way into his body. Though the injury itself was minor, the resulting infection had rendered him unable to fight back. Red strands ran up his arm towards his neck, fusing him with the thicker cords running along the wall. He was in bad shape, that much was clear. "Jane," he let out, sounding relieved. "I knew you'd be dumb enough to come for me." "Shut up," she responded. "We need to get you out of here." "What happened to you?" I asked. "I fell," he explained. "These things wrapped themselves around my leg. I just slipped." "Can you move?" I asked. "I can't even feel my legs. These things got inside me. I couldn't..." He trailed off. "Can you help me?" "Already working on it, but I need you to answer as many of my questions as you can," I explained. "Can't you get me out of here first?" "I need to know what I'm dealing with," I went on. "Your colleague, Bill, he said you heard calls for help coming from within the cave. Is that right?" "Yeah, they came from that direction," he explained as he nodded his head in the same direction the cords were leading. "There's a hole in the ground. It's too deep to climb, but I swear there are people down there. We need to get them out." "Well, let's worry about you first," I said. "But I'm going to go and check it out. Jane, stay with him. Keep him talking. Don't let him fall asleep." Following Mark's direction, I continued down the tunnel until I reached a deep pit leading infinitely down into the earth. All the organism's appendages joined at the pit and led downwards. From the bottom, I could hear faint, unintelligible calls. Though they sounded human, they resembled incomprehensible noises more than actual words. Pointing my flashlight directly down the pit didn't help much either, so to get a sense of how deep the hole stretched, I pried some wilted flesh off the wall and ignited it with my lighter. It took a few attempts due to the humid conditions of the cave, but eventually I got a small flame going. I then dropped it and watched it descend for several seconds before it landed on a narrow ledge about 100 feet down. While it wasn't the bottom of the pit, it did reveal where the sound had come from, because on the ledge sat the remains of a mangled man, his skin replaced by the organism's filaments, and the entirety of his fat and muscle consumed. Though he should have been dead, he still looked up and called out to me in a primal scream that held no decipherable meaning. The calls that Mark had heard undoubtedly came from the dead, or at least those who were now one with the organism. And without the right tools to treat Mark, he'd quickly turn into one of them. Knowing I had no way of descending the pit, I returned to Jane, who was busy at work trying to find a way to pry Mark loose. Alas, the filaments were too ingrained into his body, far beyond the point of detachment. I can see them wriggling around at the back of my eyes. They're already inside my head. It's like I can hear them whisper. "What are they saying?" I asked. "Just whispers. I don't know. Please just get me out of here," he begged. Jane, holding tightly onto Mark's left, untainted hand, turned to me with pleading eyes, a gaze I almost didn't dare to meet. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "We need to get back to the field lab. I can't help him without my tools," I explained. "But we can't leave him," she pleaded. "And you can't stay. Every minute in here increases the risk of us ending up just like him. If you want to help him, you need to come with me." "Go," Mark pleaded, his voice growing weaker and his consciousness fading. "I'll be fine." "I promise I'll be back for you," Jane said. "I know. You always come back," he said. "Come on, let's go," I ordered. I let Jane go ahead of me, but as I prepared to follow, Mark reached out with his one good hand, grabbed onto me as he pulled me in close, and whispered into my ear, "The 5th Galilean moon has been found. They're coming." Once he'd uttered those words, he immediately let go. But before I could get the chance to ask what he meant, he'd already fallen into a catatonic state. "What did he say?" Jane asked. "That we should hurry," I lied. "Keep moving." Moving our way back outside, we stumbled across the bear mother and her 3 cubs, still unconscious in a restless slumber. "Weren't there 5 cubs?" Jane pointed out. "There was," I responded, pulling the gun from my holster in preparation, but the cubs were nowhere to be found. From there, we progressed with care around each corner, constantly expecting an attack that never came. Outside, we felt a gust of cold air wash over us, finally free of the humid warmth of the caves. I took a deep breath, quickly checking the pressure gauge on my hazmat suit. There was an ample amount of oxygen left, but I'd only been wearing it for a fraction of the time Jane had. "You all right?" I asked. "Yeah, I'm behind you," she yelled, diving out of the way of a charging bear cub running straight at us. It was a horrific sight to behold, finally seeing it in clear daylight, its skin lacking most of its fur, instead covered by a countless number of fibers that had dug their way through its skin so many times that the organs had dropped from its abdomen. I fired a couple of shots at the poor thing, hitting it once in its right shoulder and once in its head. Though it mostly incapacitated the animal, it wasn't dead. It still attempted to drag its way towards us, clearly slowed down by the brain injury, but refusing to cease its chase. But having mostly eliminated the most current threat, we took the opportunity to flee the scene and headed back towards the field lab. Once we got within earshot of the site, we could hear the frantic screams coming from what remained of the crew. We pushed our way through the dense vegetation to find Gerard on the ground, trying to fight off the second missing cub, while Pearson and Mark were hitting it with whatever solid object they could get their hands on. Jane pulled the knife from my belt swiftly enough that I couldn't even think to react, and charged at the creature without hesitation, slashing and stabbing at it until it dropped Gerard and redirected its attention towards her. As soon as the crew was gone from my line of sight, I fired 3 rounds at it, hitting each time. Again, it only slowed the creature down, but enough so that Jane could cut it free from each its attached cords, which significantly weakened it even further. With a final shot to the head, it fell dead to the ground, the remaining filaments turning gray. Now that we had a few moments to recover, the crew quickly tended to their wounded colleague. Gerard's arms and torso were covered in deep lacerations, which had already been infected by the organism. Noting his poor state, I warned the rest of them not to touch them, an order they reluctantly heeded. "Has anyone else been wounded?" I asked, still not sure how far I would have to go to contain the infection. Pearson and Bill both shook their heads, and Jane hadn't once been in physical contact with the bear. The only one who'd gotten infected was Gerard. Based on what little we'd seen from the other victims, there was nothing we could do for him. "I'll patch myself up. Just give me the damn medical kit," Gerard begged, a plea Jane quickly answered. I then took the phone back from Pearson and called my supervisor back at the company. Letting it beep no more than 2 times, someone on the other end picked up. "Do you have information for us?" a voice asked, coming from a woman I had yet to put a name to, even after several years on the job. "Unspecified organism. It's parasitic in nature and seems to maintain motor control as well as limited cognitive function over its prey. Rate of spread is rapid. We're undoubtedly dealing with a Category 5 situation." "Confirmed. We've received the biological samples. The subject you're dealing with is the Crimson Nexus. So you've dealt with this before?" "We've had encounters in Siberia and Mexico. How far has the subject spread?" "It's still confined within the boundaries of the forest. What course of action do you suggest I take?" "Evacuation. Leveling measures will be taken within 90 minutes. Knowing how deep the Crimson Nexus stretched underground, I knew their idea of containment would be insufficient, only serving to mask the problem for a time. "I disagree. We need to find the source of the organism before we attempt to destroy it. You have 90 minutes to leave the area. Is that understood?" she went on, ignoring what the company would consider insubordination, as she had on many occasions before. Knowing I could do nothing to change their minds, all that was left was to follow their orders. "Understood," I meekly replied. "What am I supposed to do with the people already infected?" "Dispose of them." Still holding the phone to my ear, I glanced over at Gerard lying on the side, recalling that we had also left a man back at the caves. I had known their chances of survival were as good as non-existent, but I didn't feel confident I could execute anyone in front of their friends and colleagues. "I need you to confirm that you understand the order," the woman went on. "I understand." Ending the call on that note, I turned to the rest of the crew who'd only heard my end of the conversation, but the look on my face sufficed to convey the hopelessness of the situation. "I'm screwed, aren't I?" Gerard asked. "What's the plan?" Pearson chimed in. I knew then that the humane thing to do would be to put a quick end to Gerard's misery with a bullet to his head. I also realized that in his current state, he could easily be left behind as the company dealt with the threat. But to answer Dr. Pearson's question, there was only one thing we absolutely had to do. "We need to run like hell,"